the blood always soaked into the Persian rugs first. It was a dark, sticky crimson that smelled faintly of copper and expensive cigars. I was on my hands and knees, scrubbing at a stain that cost more than my entire life. The bristles of my brush dug into the antique wool, my knuckles white with the effort. I kept my head down, letting the cheap polyester of my uniform stretch tightly across my broad shoulders and heavy hips. In this house, my size was my armor. It made me slow, it made me soft, and most importantly, it made me entirely invisible. The men who walked these halls did not look at women who looked like me. They looked right through me, seeing only a piece of moving furniture that kept their gilded cage spotless. This was the ancestral home of the Vanguard Logistics Syndicate, a fortress of limestone and mahogany sitting at the very peak of Beacon Hill. Outside, the tourists took pictures of the gas lamps and the cobblestone streets of Boston. Inside, men in custom Italian suits orchestrated the movement of illegal cargo through the eastern seaboard ports. I did not care about the cargo, and I did not care about the blood. I only cared about the number 247,000. That was the exact dollar amount of my sister Maeve's medical debt. She was lying in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room in a hospital in Lynn, Massachusetts, hooked up to machines that charged by the minute. The American healthcare system was a meat grinder for people from South Boston. If you did not have the money, you simply stopped existing. So I took the job cleaning up after monsters, because the monsters paid in thick envelopes of untraceable cash. Fiona, the head housekeeper, stepped into the hallway, her sensible shoes making no sound on the hardwood. She was a tight-lipped woman who had served the syndicate for 40 years. She looked down at me, her eyes lingering on the damp patches of sweat on my uniform. "Get up, Bridie," she said, her voice a harsh whisper. "They need espresso in the main library, and you are the only one left on this floor." I nodded, pushing myself up from the floor, my knees aching in protest. I carried the bucket of pink, bloody water to the utility closet, my heart already beginning to hammer against my ribs. The main library was the nerve center of the house. It was protected by biometric scanners and solid titanium doors, disguised as carved oak. I washed my hands twice in scalding water, drying them on a rough towel before walking to the kitchen. The silver serving tray was heavy, loaded with 4 delicate porcelain cups, a silver pot of dark roast espresso, and a small bowl of raw sugar. I balanced it on my hip for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady my shaking hands. I walked down the long, shadowed corridor, my rubber-soled shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floorboards. The 2 armed guards outside the library did not even blink as I approached. One of them pressed his thumb to the biometric pad, and the heavy doors clicked open with a pneumatic hiss. I stepped into the room, instantly suffocated by the smell of old paper, leather bindings, and pure, concentrated tension. There were 3 men in the room. Vaughn stood by the massive arched window, looking out over the Boston skyline. He was 32 years old, the newly crowned head of the syndicate, and he looked like he was carved from ice and violence. He wore a charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His dark hair swept back from a face that belonged on a Roman coin. He possessed a cold, polished, Ivy League menace that made the air around him feel 10 degrees colder. Leaning against the far bookshelf was Kieran, his second in command. Kieran was lean, calculating, and arrogant, a man who had clawed his way up from the streets alongside Vaughn. He watched me enter with a sneer of absolute disgust, his eyes raking over my plus-size frame with open contempt. Sitting in one of the leather wingback chairs was a man I did not recognize. He was sweating profusely, his cheap cologne failing to mask the sour smell of his fear. He was a lieutenant for Rocco, the bitter rival boss who controlled the North End faction. I kept my eyes glued to the floor, moving toward the low mahogany table in the center of the room. I set the heavy silver tray down without making a single sound. Vaughn did not turn around. He spoke to the glass window, his voice a chillingly calm baritone that vibrated in my chest. "Your boss is asking for a 30% cut of the port logistics," Vaughn said, his tone devoid of any emotion. "That is not a negotiation. That is an insult." The sweating lieutenant shifted in his chair, the leather creaking loudly in the quiet room. "Rocco feels that given the recent disruptions, it is a fair price for continued peace," the man stammered. I began to pour the espresso, the dark liquid steaming in the cool air of the library. I handed the first cup to Kieran, who snatched it from my hand without looking at me. I placed the second cup in front of the sweating lieutenant. I poured the third cup, leaving it black, exactly the way Vaughn took it. I stepped back, pressing my back against the dark wood paneling of the wall, trying to melt into the shadows. Vaughn finally turned away from the window, walking slowly toward the table. He picked up a thick shipping manifest from the desk, his eyes scanning the numbers. For a fraction of a second, his back was turned to the room. In that microscopic window of time, the sweating lieutenant moved. It was a tiny, desperate motion, his hand darting over the table toward Vaughn's cup. I saw the flash of a small glass vial hidden in his palm. I saw the fine, toxic white powder fall like snow into the dark espresso. It dissolved instantly, leaving no trace on the surface. The lieutenant pulled his hand back, wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers. Time seemed to stop entirely. My brain processed the information with terrifying clarity. If Vaughn drank that coffee, he would be dead before he hit the floor. If Vaughn died, the Vanguard Syndicate would fracture into a bloody civil war. If the syndicate fractured, the money would stop flowing. If the money stopped flowing, Maeve's life support machines in Lynn would be unplugged by the end of the month. My survival instinct screamed at me to stay invisible, to let the monsters kill each other. But the crushing weight of that hospital bill overrode my fear. Vaughn tossed the manifest onto the desk and reached for his cup. His long, elegant fingers wrapped around the delicate porcelain handle. He lifted it toward his lips. I did not think. I threw my entire heavy frame forward, weaponizing my size for the first time in my life. I faked a clumsy, catastrophic stumble, my rubber shoe catching hard on the edge of the Persian rug. I let out a sharp gasp, throwing my arms out as if trying to catch my balance. My hip slammed violently into the edge of the heavy mahogany table. The impact sent the silver tray flying into the air. I crashed into Vaughn, my shoulder driving hard into his chest. The porcelain cup shattered against the floor. The scalding, poisoned espresso splashed across the rug and soaked directly into Vaughn's custom Italian leather shoes. I hit the ground hard, my knees taking the brunt of the fall. The breath knocked completely out of my lungs. Chaos erupted in a fraction of a second. The deafening roar of chairs scraping backward filled the room. I heard the terrifying, metallic clatter of handguns being drawn. "Do not move a single muscle," Kieran roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. I lay on the floor, gasping for air, my face pressed against the damp wool of the rug. I waited for the bullet to tear through my back. I waited for the darkness to take me. "Stand down, Kieran," Vaughn said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the panic like a straight razor. I slowly opened my eyes, my cheek still resting on the floor. Kieran was standing over me, his silenced pistol aimed directly at the back of my head. The sweating lieutenant was frozen in his chair, his face completely drained of color. Vaughn was looking down at his ruined shoes. He did not look angry. He looked intensely, terrifyingly curious. He crouched down slowly, his expensive trousers pulling tight across his thighs. He ignored me entirely, his eyes fixed on the puddle of spilled espresso. A strange, chemical hiss was rising from the damp wool. The dark liquid was bubbling slightly, eating away at the ancient fibers of the rug, leaving a faint, acrid smoke in the air. Vaughn stared at the chemical reaction for a long, silent moment. The library was so quiet I could hear the blood rushing in my own ears. Vaughn slowly turned his head, his gaze locking onto the sweating lieutenant. The man began to shake violently, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "I swear to God, Vaughn, I do not know what that is," the lieutenant choked out, his voice cracking. Vaughn stood up, brushing a speck of dust from his lapel. "Kieran," Vaughn said softly, "take our guest down to the soundproof rooms in the basement. Find out exactly who gave him the powder. Then send him back to Rocco in several small boxes." The lieutenant opened his mouth to scream, but Kieran stepped forward, driving the butt of his pistol brutally into the side of the man's head. The lieutenant collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. Kieran grabbed the unconscious man by the collar of his cheap suit, dragging him across the floor and out the heavy titanium doors. The doors hissed shut, sealing me inside the room with the head of the syndicate. I was still on my hands and knees, trembling so violently my teeth rattled. I tried to push myself backward, trying to crawl back into the shadows, trying to become invisible again. "Stop moving," Vaughn commanded. I froze instantly, my breath catching in my throat. Vaughn walked around the ruined table, his ruined shoes leaving faint, toxic footprints on the hardwood. He stopped right in front of me. "Look at me," he ordered. I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking my head slightly. I said, "Look at me, Bridie." The sound of my name on his lips sent a shockwave of pure terror down my spine. He knew my name. I slowly lifted my head, opening my eyes to meet his. His gaze was heavy, dark, and entirely consuming. He was not looking at a piece of furniture anymore. He was looking at me. He saw the fear in my eyes, the sweat on my forehead, the soft, heavy curves of my body trembling under the cheap polyester. He saw exactly what I had done. He knew I had seen the poison. He knew I had thrown myself into the line of fire to save his life. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as dust. "I tripped, sir," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I am so sorry about your shoes. I will pay for them out of my wages." Vaughn stared at me for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then, very slowly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward into a terrifying ghost of a smile. "You are a terrible liar, Bridie," he murmured. He reached down, his large, warm hand wrapping around my upper arm. His grip was firm, pulling me up from the floor with effortless strength. I stood before him, feeling massive and clumsy, my heart hammering against my ribs. He did not let go of my arm. His thumb brushed lightly against the cheap fabric of my sleeve. "Go to the kitchen," he said softly. "Tell Fiona you are no longer cleaning the lower floors. From this moment on, you are reassigned exclusively to my private wing on the 3rd floor." Panic flared hot and bright in my chest. The 3rd floor was a fortress within a fortress. No one went up there except Vaughn and his elite guards. "Sir, please," I stammered, trying to pull my arm away. "I am not trained for the private quarters. I make mistakes. I am clumsy." Vaughn's grip tightened just enough to let me know I was not going anywhere. "You are exactly what I need you to be," he said, his eyes darkening. "Go." I turned and fled the library, my legs shaking so badly I barely made it down the hallway. That night my entire reality shifted. The 3rd floor was a suffocating velvet cage. The air up there smelled of cedar, expensive bourbon, and Vaughn. The biometric locks on the stairwell doors meant I could not leave without his explicit permission. I was trapped in a sprawling suite of rooms filled with priceless art, massive fireplaces, and a silence so deep it made my ears ring. For the first week, I tried to maintain my invisibility. I kept my head down, dusting the same mahogany shelves over and over again, but Vaughn changed his routine. He stopped going to the port offices. He began working exclusively from the massive desk in his private study, leaving the door wide open so he could watch me. The tension in the air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on my chest until I felt like I was suffocating. Every time I bent over to polish a table, I could feel his eyes on me. Every time I reached up to dust a high shelf, I could feel his gaze tracking the pull of my uniform across my hips. He did not speak to me. He just watched, a predator studying a very slow, very soft prey. On the 10th day, I walked into the massive walk-in closet to organize his suits. Sitting in the center of the room was a large black velvet box. My name was written on a heavy card resting on the lid. My hands shook as I untied the silk ribbon and opened the box. Inside lay 5 custom-made uniforms. They were not cheap, stiff polyester. They were spun from the heaviest, softest black silk I had ever touched. They were tailored perfectly to my exact measurements, designed to cling to every curve, every dip, every heavy line of my body. I stared at the silk, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. He had measured me with his eyes. He had mapped my body while I was scrubbing his floors. I heard the soft tread of his footsteps behind me. I spun around, clutching the box to my chest. Vaughn stood in the doorway of the closet, leaning against the frame, his hands in his pockets. "The polyester offends me," he said simply. "Burn it. Put the silk on." "I cannot wear this, sir," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It is too delicate. It will ruin when I clean." "You are not scrubbing floors anymore, Bridie," he replied, his voice dropping to that chilling baritone. "You are taking care of me. Put it on." I retreated into the attached bathroom, locking the door behind me. I stripped off the stiff, sweaty polyester, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the buttons. I slipped the black silk over my head. It fell against my skin like cool water. It hugged my heavy breasts, cinched tightly at my waist, and flared out over my wide hips. I looked at myself in the massive, gold-rimmed mirror. I did not look invisible anymore. I looked like something expensive. I looked like something owned. When I stepped back out into the bedroom, Vaughn was sitting in a velvet armchair, waiting. His eyes swept over me, darkening to the color of a bruised sky. He let out a slow, ragged breath, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair. "Perfect," he murmured. The next 4 days were a psychological torture. The silk uniforms made me hyper-aware of my own body. Every time I moved, the fabric whispered against my skin. Every time I walked past Vaughn, I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He began to leave things for me to find. A stack of $100 bills on the nightstand. A diamond tennis bracelet resting on the edge of the bathtub. I did not touch any of it. I left the money where it lay. I pushed the diamonds aside to clean the marble. I was a girl from Southie. I knew that when men like Vaughn gave you things, they were not gifts. They were chains. The anxiety over Maeve's medical bills was eating me alive. The hospital had called my burner phone 3 times that week, leaving automated voicemails about final notices and collections. I was trapped in a gilded cage, wearing silk, while my sister was drowning in debt. I reached my breaking point on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The sky over Boston was dark and bruised, rain lashing against the reinforced glass of the third-floor windows. I sat at the small desk in the servants' pantry, staring at a blank piece of paper. I picked up a pen and wrote my 2-week notice. My hand shook as I signed my name at the bottom. I folded the paper carefully, slipping it into the pocket of my silk apron. I was going to quit. I was going to walk out of this fortress, go back to my miserable, damp basement apartment in South Boston, and figure out another way to save Maeve. I walked down the long hallway toward Vaughn's private study. The door was partially open. I pushed it wide, stepping into the room. Vaughn was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, a glass of amber bourbon in his hand. He looked up as I entered, his eyes locking onto mine. "Sir," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "I need a moment of your time." He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "Speak," he commanded. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the folded piece of paper. I walked forward and placed it gently on the center of his desk. "I am giving my 2 weeks' notice, sir," I said, forcing myself to look him in the eye. "I appreciate the opportunity, but I am returning to my apartment in South Boston. I cannot work here anymore." Vaughn did not look at the paper. He did not even blink. He took a slow sip of his bourbon, the ice clinking softly against the crystal glass. He set the glass down and folded his hands on the desk. "You are not going back to South Boston, Bridie," he said, his voice dangerously calm. I stiffened, my nails digging into the palms of my hands. "I have the right to resign, sir," I insisted, my heart beginning to race. "I am a free citizen." Vaughn let out a low, dark chuckle that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "A free citizen," he repeated, tasting the words as if they amused him. He reached into the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a thick manila folder. He tossed it onto the desk, right on top of my resignation letter. "Open it," he ordered. I hesitated, my stomach twisting into a tight knot. I reached out with trembling fingers and flipped open the cover of the folder. The first document was a deed. It was the deed to the crumbling brick apartment building in South Boston where I rented my basement unit. The owner listed at the top was Vanguard Logistics Holdings. I stared at the paper, my brain struggling to process the information. "You bought my building?" I whispered, horror creeping up my throat. "Turn the page," Vaughn said softly. I flipped to the next document. It was a piece of heavy hospital letterhead from the billing department in Lynn, Massachusetts. It was a final statement for the account of Maeve. The balance at the bottom of the page, which had haunted my nightmares for 2 years, was printed in bold black ink. $0. Paid in full. A cashier's check receipt was stapled to the back, showing a transfer of $247,000 from an anonymous trust. My knees went weak. I grabbed the edge of the mahogany desk to keep from collapsing. "You paid it," I gasped, tears of pure shock springing to my eyes. "You paid her debt." Vaughn stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the desk. He walked around the heavy wood, moving with the silent, lethal grace of a predator closing in on its prey. I backed up instinctively, but my back hit the heavy leather sofa. I was trapped. Vaughn stopped inches from me, his chest almost brushing against mine. He reached out, his large hand wrapping around the back of my neck, his thumb resting heavily on my pulse point. "I bought your building," he whispered, his face so close to mine I could feel the heat of his breath. "I paid your sister's debt. I own the roof over your head, and I own the machines keeping your family alive." A tear spilled over my lashes, tracking hot and fast down my cheek. "Why?" I choked out, my voice breaking. "Why would you do this?" Vaughn's eyes darkened, a terrifying, obsessive hunger burning in the depths of his gaze. "Because you saved my life," he murmured, his thumb stroking the soft skin of my neck. "And in my world, when you save a life, you own it. But I do not want to own your life, Bridie. I want you to own mine." He leaned in, his lips brushing against the shell of my ear, sending a violent shiver down my spine. "If you walk out that door, the protection vanishes," he whispered, his voice dropping to a lethal baritone fry. "The hospital funding stops. The apartment building is demolished. You belong to me now. You are never leaving this house again." Vaughn's eyes darkened, a terrifying, obsessive hunger burning in the depths of his gaze. "Because you saved my life," he murmured, his thumb stroking the soft skin of my neck. "And in my world, when you save a life, you own it. But I do not want to own your life, Bridie. I want you to own mine." He leaned in, his lips brushing against the shell of my ear, sending a violent shiver down my spine. "If you walk out that door, The protection vanishes, he whispered, his voice dropping to a lethal baritone fry. The hospital funding stops. The apartment building is demolished. You belong to me now. You are never leaving this house again. The absolute finality of his words settled over me like a heavy wool blanket, suffocating and warm all at once. My legs finally gave out beneath me. I sank backward, the backs of my knees hitting the edge of the heavy leather sofa. I collapsed onto the cushions, the breath shuddering out of my lungs in a broken, ragged gasp. Vaughn followed me down immediately. He did not push, and he did not use force, but his large, muscular frame caged me in completely. He knelt on the Persian rug between my parted knees, his hands resting on the leather cushions on either side of my hips. I was trapped in the small space between his arms, entirely eclipsed by his shadow. I looked up at him, my chest heaving beneath the tight black silk of my uniform. I expected to see the cold, calculating syndicate boss, who had just ordered a man to be sent back in small boxes. Instead, I saw a man who looked like he was starving to death, and I was the only meal left on Earth. He reached out, his long, elegant fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the collar of my uniform. "You have spent your entire life trying to be invisible, Bridie," he whispered, his voice thick with a dark, heavy emotion. "You hid behind your clothes. You hid behind your silence. You hid behind the way the world looks, right past women who look like you." His knuckles grazed the soft, heavy curve of my breast, sending a jolt of pure electricity straight to my core. "But you are not invisible to me," he continued, his eyes dropping to my lips. "You are the only thing in this entire godforsaken city that I can actually see." I squeezed my eyes shut, a hot tear slipping down my cheek. "Please," I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. "I do not know how to do this. I do not know how to be what you want." Vaughn let out a low, rough sound that vibrated deep in his chest. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against mine. "You do not have to do anything," he murmured. "You just have to let me worship you." His hands moved to the top button of my silk uniform. Panic flared hot and bright in my chest, a lifetime of deep, agonizing insecurity rushing to the surface. I reached up, my trembling hands grabbing his wrists to stop him. "No," I pleaded, my voice cracking with shame. "Please, Vaughn, do not look at me. I am not beautiful. I am not like the women you are used to. I am heavy. I am soft. I am ruined." Vaughn's grip on my waist tightened, his fingers digging into the soft flesh of my hips with a fierce, possessive strength. He pulled my hands away from his chest, pinning my wrists gently but firmly to the leather sofa. "Do not ever speak about what is mine that way again," he commanded, his voice a dark, lethal rumble. "Every ounce of you is perfect. Every heavy curve, every soft line, every inch of skin. It was made specifically for my hands." He released my wrists and went back to the buttons of my uniform. I lay there, paralyzed by a terrifying mixture of fear and a dark, undeniable desire that was beginning to pool low in my stomach. He unbuttoned the silk slowly, agonizingly, treating the fabric as if it were wrapping a priceless artifact. When the uniform fell open, the cool air of the study washed over my heated skin. I tried to turn my head away, squeezing my eyes shut to hide from the shame, but Vaughn would not let me hide. He cupped my jaw with one large hand, forcing me to look at him. His eyes were entirely black, dilated with a raw, primal hunger as he took in the sight of my body. He did not look at me with disgust. He did not look at me with the polite, dismissive pity I had received from men my entire life. He looked at me with absolute religious reverence. He lowered his head, his lips pressing a burning kiss to the soft, heavy curve of my stomach. I gasped, my back arching off the leather cushions as a wave of pure pleasure crashed through my nervous system. He kissed the stretch marks on my hips, tracing the silver lines with his tongue as if they were a map to a hidden treasure. He worshipped every part of me that I had spent 24 years hating. He dismantled my armor piece by piece, replacing my deep-seated shame with a suffocating, intoxicating heat. When he finally took me, it was not a conquest. It was a surrender. It was a slow, agonizingly tender claiming that left me shattered and completely rebuilt in his image. I cried out his name, my fingers digging into the heavy muscles of his back, anchoring myself to the monster who had just bought my entire world. When it was over, the rain was still lashing against the reinforced glass of the study windows. Vaughn gathered my heavy, exhausted body into his arms, lifting me from the sofa with effortless strength. He carried me down the long, shadowed hallway of the third floor, his bare chest warm against my cheek. He bypassed my small servant quarters entirely. He carried me straight into the master suite, a massive room dominated by a king-sized bed and a wall of bulletproof glass overlooking the Boston skyline. He laid me down on the dark, heavy sheets, pulling a thick down comforter over my shivering shoulders. He climbed in beside me, pulling my back flush against his chest, his arm wrapping tightly around my waist to anchor me to him. "Sleep, my queen," he whispered into my hair. "You are safe now." That night marked the beginning of my new reality. The days began to blur into the nights, melting together in a haze of dark mahogany, heavy silk, and suffocating isolation. I was no longer a maid in the Beacon Hill fortress. I was the ghost that haunted the third floor. Vaughn's possessiveness grew with every passing hour, evolving into a borderline mania that dictated every aspect of my existence. He refused to let me out of his sight for more than a few minutes at a time. If he had to take a meeting in the lower levels, he locked the biometric doors to the third floor, sealing me inside the velvet cage. I spent my days wandering the massive suite of rooms, my bare feet sinking into the priceless Persian rugs. I wore nothing but the custom black silk he had ordered for me, or one of his heavy charcoal dress shirts that smelled of cedar and expensive cologne. Fiona, the head housekeeper, was the only other person allowed on the third floor. She came up twice a day to deliver trays of rich, heavy food. She no longer looked at me with strict authority. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, addressing me with a cold, terrifying deference. "Yes, Miss Bridie. Right away, Miss Bridie." It made my skin crawl. I was a working-class girl from Southie, and now I was being treated like Mafia royalty. But despite the luxury, despite the agonizingly tender way Vaughn worshipped my body every night, the fear never truly left me. I knew who these men were. I knew that the Vanguard Syndicate was built on blood, betrayal, and absolute control. I knew that Vaughn's obsession with me was a beautiful, terrifying trap. If he ever grew tired of me, if I ever displeased him, the protection would vanish. Maeve's medical bills would return. My life would be destroyed. So, I began to plan for the impossible. I began to build a secret, desperate safety net. It started small, a tiny rebellion born out of pure survival instinct. Vaughn was careless with his money. He left thick rolls of untraceable $100 bills in the pockets of his custom suits, on the marble countertops of the bathroom, and in the drawers of his study. One rainy afternoon, while Vaughn was downstairs interrogating a smuggler, I found a stack of cash sitting on his nightstand. My hands shook as I reached out and slid $200 bills from the center of the stack. I folded them tightly, my heart hammering against my ribs, terrified that the biometric cameras in the ceiling were watching me. I walked into the massive walk-in closet and dug out the cheap, battered winter coat I had brought with me from South Boston. I found a small tear in the lining near the hem. I slipped the folded bills inside, pushing them deep into the cheap insulation. It was a microscopic victory, but it made me feel like I could still breathe. Over the next few weeks, I meticulously hoarded cash. A 50 here, 100 there. I never took enough to be noticed, but slowly, the lining of my winter coat began to grow heavy with the promise of escape. My other secret rebellion was a small, pink blister pack of pills. Before I had moved into the Beacon Hill mansion, I had visited a free clinic in Southie to get a prescription for birth control. I had brought a 6-month supply with me, hidden in the bottom of my cheap canvas duffel bag. Every morning, at exactly 7:15, I locked myself in the master bathroom. I turned on the heavy brass faucet to mask the sound. I popped one tiny pink pill through the foil backing, placed it on my tongue, and swallowed it with a handful of cold tap water. It was my daily ritual of defiance. Vaughn owned my apartment building. He owned my sister's life support machines. He owned the clothes on my back and the bed I slept in. But he did not own my body from the inside out. I would not bring a child into this world of blood and titanium doors. I would not give him an heir to anchor me to this syndicate forever. As the weeks turned into a month, the outside world began to bleed into our isolated sanctuary. The war with Rocco's North End faction was escalating rapidly. The tension in the house grew thick and suffocating, a constant, vibrating hum of impending violence. Vaughn began coming home later and later, his face pale and drawn, his knuckles bruised and split. He smelled of cordite, stale cigar smoke, and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. He would strip off his ruined suits in the dark, leaving them in a heap on the floor for Fiona to burn. He would climb into bed, his skin freezing cold, and pull my heavy body flush against his chest. He would bury his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling my scent as if it were the only oxygen left in the room. "They hit a shipment at the southern docks tonight," he whispered one evening, his voice rough and exhausted. "We lost 3 men. Rocco is getting desperate." I lay perfectly still in the dark, my heart aching for the violence that consumed him, even as I feared it. I reached back, my fingers tangling in his dark hair, offering him the only comfort I had left to give. He tightened his grip on my waist, his breathing slowing as he listened to the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. "They will never touch you, Bridie," he murmured, his voice dropping to a dark, lethal promise. "I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let anyone look at you." His paranoia began to spiral out of control. He doubled the armed guards outside the library. He installed a secondary biometric scanner on the door to the master suite, requiring both a thumbprint and a retinal scan to open it. He fired a young security guard simply because the boy had lingered for 2 seconds too long while looking at me in the hallway. The velvet cage was shrinking, the walls closing in on me until I felt like I was constantly gasping for air. Kieran's resentment toward me grew into open, venomous hatred. Whenever Vaughn was not looking, Kieran would stare at me with eyes full of pure, unadulterated disgust. He saw me as a massive, glaring liability. He saw a fat, slow, working-class maid who had somehow bewitched the most ruthless syndicate boss on the East Coast. One afternoon, Kieran came up to the 3rd floor to deliver a stack of encrypted shipping manifests. Vaughn was in the shower, the sound of running water echoing through the suite. I was sitting in the velvet armchair by the window, reading a book. Kieran dropped the files onto the mahogany desk with a loud, aggressive slap. I flinched, my eyes darting up to meet his cold, calculating gaze. "You think you are safe up here, do you not?" Kieran sneered, his voice a low, mocking whisper. "You think because he bought you some silk and paid off your pathetic sister's bills, you are untouchable." I kept my face perfectly blank, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my fear. "I am just doing what I am told, Kieran," I replied evenly. Kieran let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You are a weakness, Bridie. You make him slow. You make him soft. And in our world, soft things get slaughtered." He leaned across the desk, his eyes dropping to my heavy waistline with a look of absolute revulsion. "Enjoy the silk while it lasts, sweetheart. Because when Rocco finally makes his move, Vaughn will not be able to protect a target as big as you." Kieran turned and walked out of the room, the heavy titanium door hissing shut behind him. I sat in the chair, my hands trembling so violently I had to drop the book onto my lap. I knew Kieran was right. I was a liability, and the terrifying truth was, I was beginning to feel the physical toll of the constant, crushing stress. 2 months into my captivity, my body began to betray me. It started with a bone-deep, paralyzing exhaustion. I had always been a strong woman, used to working 14-hour shifts on my feet, scrubbing floors and carrying heavy buckets of water, but now, simply walking from the bed to the master bathroom felt like wading through wet cement. My limbs felt heavy and useless. I found myself falling asleep in the middle of the afternoon, curled up on the leather sofa in the study, unable to keep my eyes open. Then came the nausea. It hit me on a cold, gray Tuesday morning in early November. I woke up before Vaughn, the room still shrouded in deep shadows. A sudden, violent wave of sickness rolled through my stomach, so intense it made my vision blur. I clamped a hand over my mouth, throwing the heavy down comforter off my body. I sprinted across the thick Persian rug, my bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. I barely made it to the master bathroom before I collapsed to my knees in front of the cold marble toilet. I retched violently, my stomach twisting into agonizing knots. I gripped the edges of the porcelain bowl, my knuckles white, cold sweat beading on my forehead. When the sickness finally passed, I slumped back against the marble wall, gasping for air. I wiped my mouth with the back of my trembling hand, trying to rationalize what was happening. "It is just the stress," I told myself, my internal monologue frantic and desperate. "It is the claustrophobia. It is the rich, heavy food Fiona keeps forcing me to eat. It is the constant fear of Rocco's men breaking down the doors." I stood up slowly, my legs shaking, and walked over to the massive gold-rimmed mirror above the sink. I looked at my reflection. My face was pale and drawn, dark circles bruised beneath my eyes, but it was my body that made my breath catch in my throat. My breasts, always heavy, were now swollen and incredibly tender to the touch. The soft curve of my stomach felt different, tighter, heavier. A cold, terrifying dread began to pool at the base of my spine. "No," I whispered to the empty room. "No, that is impossible. I take the pill every single day. I never miss a dose." I opened the top drawer of the vanity and pulled out the small pink blister pack. I counted the empty foil pockets. I was perfectly on schedule. There was no physical way I could be pregnant. I shoved the pack back into the drawer and splashed freezing cold water onto my face, forcing the panic down into a dark, locked box in my mind. But the symptoms did not stop. They escalated with terrifying speed. By the end of the 8th week, the smell of Vaughn's dark roast espresso made me violently ill. The scent of his expensive cedar cologne, which I had grown to love, now sent me running for the bathroom. My period was late, not just a few days late, 3 weeks late. The wall of denial I had built in my mind finally shattered into a million jagged pieces. I had to know. I had to be absolutely sure. I waited until Thursday afternoon. Vaughn had called an emergency meeting with his capos in the soundproof basement rooms to discuss a retaliation strike against Rocco. He told me he would be gone for at least 2 hours. He kissed my forehead, locked the biometric doors to the 3rd floor, and left me alone. I waited 10 minutes to ensure he was gone. Then, I moved. I knew that Dr. Sterling, the syndicate's corrupt concierge physician, kept a fully stocked medical supply cabinet in the private clinic on the 2nd floor. I also knew that the dumbwaiter in the servants' pantry connected the 3rd floor directly to the 2nd floor laundry room. It was a tight fit, designed for laundry baskets, not for a plus-size woman. But desperation makes you incredibly flexible. I squeezed my heavy frame into the wooden box of the dumbwaiter, pulling my knees tightly to my chest. I grabbed the thick rope and began to lower myself down the dark, dusty shaft. The friction burned the skin off my palms, but I did not make a sound. The box hit the bottom with a soft thud. I pushed the wooden door open and tumbled out into the 2nd floor laundry room. The house was dead silent. All the guards were stationed on the perimeter or down in the basement with Vaughn. I crept down the carpeted hallway, my heart hammering so loudly I was terrified it would echo off the walls. I reached the heavy oak door of the medical wing. It was unlocked. I slipped inside, instantly assaulted by the sharp, sterile smell of rubbing alcohol and iodine. I moved quickly to the glass-fronted supply cabinets. I scanned the neat rows of bandages, syringes, and painkillers. There, on the bottom shelf, tucked behind a box of surgical gloves, was a stack of white cardboard boxes. Pregnancy tests. I grabbed one, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it on the linoleum floor. I shoved the box deep into the pocket of my silk uniform. I turned and ran back to the laundry room, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I climbed back into the dumbwaiter and hauled myself up the shaft, my muscles screaming in protest. I tumbled out onto the floor of the 3rd floor pantry, covered in dust and sweat. I did not stop to catch my breath. I sprinted down the hallway and locked myself inside the master bathroom. The heavy marble room felt like a tomb. I ripped the cardboard box open, my fingernails tearing at the foil wrapper inside. I sat down on the cold marble toilet and took the test. I placed the plastic stick flat on the edge of the sink. The instructions on the box said to wait 3 minutes. Those 3 minutes were the longest, most agonizing stretch of time in my entire life. I paced the length of the bathroom, my bare feet slapping against the cold stone. I stared at the heavy brass fixtures, the expensive imported soaps, the thick, fluffy towels bearing the Vanguard Syndicate crest. I thought about Maeve, lying in her hospital bed in Lynn, her life paid for by the monster who owned me. I thought about the untraceable $100 bills hidden in the lining of my winter coat. I thought about the blood on Vaughn's hands. The digital clock on the wall clicked forward. 3 minutes. I stopped pacing. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I walked slowly toward the sink. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Please, God. I whispered into the silence. Please. I opened my eyes and looked down at the plastic stick. 2 bright, unmistakable pink lines glared back at me. Positive. The air was instantly sucked out of the room. The marble walls seemed to tilt and spin around me. A high-pitched ringing started in my ears, drowning out the sound of my own ragged breathing. I gripped the edges of the sink, my knuckles turning white, trying to keep myself from collapsing onto the floor. I am pregnant. I am carrying the heir to the Vanguard Logistics Syndicate. I am carrying the child of a ruthless, beautiful monster. Pure, unadulterated panic exploded in my chest. How? My brain screamed. How is this possible? I took the pill. I took it every single day. I never missed a dose. I spun around, my eyes locking onto the top drawer of the vanity. I lunged forward, ripping the drawer open with so much force it nearly came off its tracks. I grabbed the small pink blister pack of birth control pills. I stared at it, my chest heaving. The foil backing was intact. The tiny pink pills sat perfectly in their little plastic bubbles. It looked exactly like the prescription I had picked up at the free clinic in Southie. I pressed my thumbnail into the foil, popping out tomorrow's pill into the palm of my hand. I held it up to the harsh vanity lights. It was the right color. It was the right shape. But as I stared at it, a cold, terrifying realization began to creep over me. The edges of the pill were slightly powdery. The pills from the clinic had a hard, glossy coating. My hand began to shake violently. I placed the tiny pink pill between my thumb and forefinger. I squeezed. The pill did not resist. It did not snap or break into hard pieces. It crumbled instantly under the pressure of my nails, collapsing into a fine, powdery dust that coated my fingertips. I stared at the dust, my heart stopping completely in my chest. I slowly raised my trembling fingers to my lips. I touched the tip of my tongue to the pink powder. It was sweet. It was pure concentrated sugar. A sob tore its way out of my throat, a sound of absolute devastating betrayal. He had swapped them. The monster had found my secret stash. He had taken away my only shield, my only piece of control, and replaced it with sugar pills. He had engineered this entire thing from the very beginning. Suddenly, the heavy electronic lock on the bathroom door clicked loudly. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. The heavy mahogany door swung open on its silent hinges. Vaughn stood in the doorway. He was impeccably dressed in a pristine charcoal suit, his dark hair swept back perfectly, his face a mask of cold, aristocratic calm. He did not look surprised to see me crying. He did not look surprised to see the crushed pink powder on my fingers. His dark eyes slowly tracked across the room, landing directly on the plastic stick resting on the edge of the sink. He stared at the two pink lines for a long, silent moment. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like I was drowning in it. Then, very slowly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward into a chilling, triumphant smile. He stepped into the bathroom, the door hissing shut and locking automatically behind him. He walked toward me, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the marble floor. "You swapped them," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. "You swapped my pills." Vaughn stopped right in front of me, his large frame completely blocking my path to the door. He reached out, his warm hand gently wiping a tear from my cheek. "I told you, Brighty," he murmured, his voice dropping to a lethal baritone fry that vibrated in the marrow of my bones. "I do not leave my assets unprotected, and I do not leave my future to chance." He leaned in, his lips brushing against my trembling jaw, his hand dropping to rest heavily and possessively over my soft stomach. "You were always going to carry my heir. You were always going to be the mother of this syndicate." He pressed a burning kiss to the corner of my mouth, his eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying, absolute certainty. "You are mine for eternity." He stepped into the bathroom, the door hissing shut and locking automatically behind him. He walked toward me, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the marble floor. "You swapped them," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. "You swapped my pills." Vaughn stopped right in front of me, his large frame completely blocking my path to the door. He reached out, his warm hand gently wiping a tear from my cheek. "I told you, Brighty," he murmured, his voice dropping to a lethal baritone fry that vibrated in the marrow of my bones. "I do not leave my assets unprotected, and I do not leave my future to chance." He leaned in, his lips brushing against my trembling jaw, his hand dropping to rest heavily and possessively over my soft stomach. "You were always going to carry my heir. You were always going to be the mother of this syndicate." He pressed a burning kiss to the corner of my mouth, his eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying, absolute certainty. "You are mine for eternity." The cold marble of the bathroom counter pressed hard against my lower back, grounding me in a reality I could no longer escape. I stared into his dark, consuming eyes, the faint taste of sugar still lingering on my tongue. The fight drained out of me, not in a sudden rush, but in a slow, agonizing bleed. I closed my eyes and let my head fall forward, resting my forehead against the heavy, expensive wool of his suit jacket. Vaughn let out a long, ragged breath, his arms wrapping around me, pulling my trembling body flush against his chest. He held me as if I were the only solid thing in a collapsing universe. Over the next 5 months, the Beacon Hill mansion transformed from a velvet cage into a titanium vault. As my pregnancy advanced, my body changed with a rapid, undeniable heaviness. The soft curves that had once made me invisible to the world now made me the absolute center of Vaughn's obsessive universe. He brought in a private tailor from Milan to design custom maternity wear. I was draped in heavy, flowing silks in deep emeralds, rich burgundies, and midnight blacks. He showered me with diamonds, fastening cold, heavy necklaces around my throat before he left for the port each morning. He revered my changing, heavier body as if I were a goddess carved from marble. Every night, he would kneel on the Persian rug beside the bed, pressing his face to my swollen belly, listening to the heartbeat of his unborn heir. The security protocols on the 3rd floor were upgraded to a level of sheer paranoia. The biometric scanners were recalibrated weekly. The windows were reinforced with a secondary layer of ballistic glass. Dr. Sterling, the syndicate's elite concierge obstetrician, was brought to the mansion every single morning. He was a tall, graying man from Massachusetts General Hospital, his medical license bought and paid for by Vanguard blood money. He would set up his portable ultrasound machine in the master suite, his hands always trembling slightly under Vaughn's lethal, unblinking stare. "The baby is thriving, Mr. Vaughn," Dr. Sterling would say, wiping the cold gel from my stomach with a sterile towel. "The heart rate is incredibly strong. Miss Bridie is in perfect health." Vaughn would nod slowly, handing the doctor a thick envelope of untraceable cash before having him escorted out by armed guards. I would lie on the heavy silk sheets, staring up at the molded ceiling, grappling with the dark, suffocating acceptance of my new life. I thought about Maeve, my sister, lying in her hospital bed in Lynn. Fiona, the head housekeeper, brought me weekly updates printed on heavy hospital letterhead. Maeve was receiving the best experimental treatments in the state, all funded by the anonymous trust Vaughn had established. She was getting better. She was going to live. And the price of her life was my absolute surrender to the Vanguard Syndicate. I walked into the massive walk-in closet one afternoon, the heavy emerald silk of my gown brushing against the hardwood floor. I reached into the back corner and pulled out my old, battered winter coat from South Boston. I ran my fingers over the torn lining near the hem. I could feel the thick, stiff wad of $100 bills I had meticulously hoarded over the first few months. It was my escape fund. It was my ticket out of the darkness. I stood there in the quiet closet, the weight of the child pressing down on my pelvis, the heavy diamonds resting against my collarbone. I pulled the cash out of the lining, a thick stack of green paper that smelled of dust and old fear. I walked out of the closet, crossed the master suite, and tossed the money into the roaring fireplace. I watched the flames consume the bills, the edges curling and turning black. I was not going to run. I was not going to raise my child in a damp basement apartment in Southie, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the monsters to find me. If I was going to be trapped in a world of monsters, I was going to make sure my child was the one who ruled them. But the outside world was not willing to leave us in peace. By my 7th month, the syndicate war with Rocco's North End faction had reached a boiling point. Vanguard Logistics was losing ground. 3 of our major smuggling routes had been intercepted by federal agents, tipped off by Rocco's informants. The tension in the mansion was a physical weight, a vibrating hum of impending violence that made my skin crawl. Vaughn stopped sleeping. He spent his nights pacing the length of the study, a glass of amber bourbon in his hand, his eyes dark and hollow. On a freezing Thursday evening in late January, the inevitable finally happened. Vaughn walked into the master suite, his face a mask of cold, carved stone. He was wearing his heavy tactical vest beneath his custom charcoal suit. I sat up on the edge of the bed, my hand instinctively resting on my swollen belly. "What is happening?" I asked, my voice tight with anxiety. "Rocco has called for a parley," Vaughn said, checking the magazine of his sidearm before sliding it into his shoulder holster. "A ceasefire summit in a neutral warehouse in South Boston." I stood up, the heavy silk of my gown pooling around my bare feet. "You cannot go," I said, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. "It is a trap, Vaughn. Rocco does not negotiate. He slaughters." Vaughn crossed the room in 3 long strides, his hands coming up to cup my face. His thumbs brushed over my cheekbones, his eyes burning with a fierce, desperate light. "I have to go, Bridie," he murmured, his voice rough. "If I do not show up, the remaining capos will see it as weakness. The syndicate will fracture." He leaned down, pressing a hard, bruising kiss to my lips. "I am leaving Kieran in charge of the house detail," he said, pulling back to look me in the eye. "He has 20 of our best men stationed on the perimeter. The 3rd floor will be on full biometric lockdown until I return. Do not open the doors for anyone." A cold shiver ran down my spine at the mention of Kieran's name. "Kieran hates me," I whispered, my fingers gripping the lapels of his suit. "He looks at me like I am a disease." Vaughn's jaw tightened, a dangerous muscle ticking in his cheek. "Kieran is a street dog, but he is loyal to the Vanguard," Vaughn replied. "He knows that if a single hair on your head is harmed, I will flay him alive and salt his wounds." Vaughn knelt down, pressing one final kiss to my stomach. "I will be back before dawn, my queen," he promised. He stood up, turned on his heel, and walked out of the suite. The heavy titanium doors hissed shut behind him, the biometric locks engaging with a loud, final click. I was alone in the gilded vault. The hours dragged by with agonizing slowness. Outside, a brutal nor'easter was battering the city, the wind howling against the reinforced glass of the windows. I paced the length of the master suite, my bare feet sinking into the Persian rugs. I could not shake the deep, primal feeling of dread that was pooling in my gut. I knew the men of this world. I knew that loyalty was just a word they used until a better offer came along. At exactly 2 a.m, the unthinkable happened. The lights in the master suite flickered once, twice, and then died completely. The low, constant hum of the mansion's climate control system ground to a halt. The small green lights on the biometric keypads beside the doors went dark. Total, suffocating blackness swallowed the room. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I waited for the heavy, mechanical roar of the backup generators in the basement to kick in. 10 seconds passed. 30 seconds. A full minute. Nothing but the sound of the wind screaming against the glass. The backup generators had failed. Or, more accurately, they had been manually disabled. My survival instinct, honed by years of living in the shadows of Southie, exploded into sharp, terrifying focus. This was not a power grid failure. This was an inside job. I moved instantly, my bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. I navigated the pitch-black room by memory, moving away from the bed and pressing my back against the cold mahogany paneling near the massive stone fireplace. I held my breath, my hands resting protectively over my heavy belly. A loud, metallic grinding echoed through the silent suite. Someone was manually overriding the hydraulic pressure on the titanium doors. The heavy doors groaned, sliding apart just enough for a man to slip through. A beam of harsh white light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the room. I pressed myself deeper into the shadows, my heart hammering so violently I thought it would crack my ribs. The beam of light settled on the empty, rumpled sheets of the king-sized bed. Well. A voice sneered from the doorway. It was Kieran. He stepped into the room, holding a heavy tactical flashlight in his left hand and a silenced pistol in his right. The sharp, metallic smell of fresh blood rolled off his clothes, filling the stagnant air of the suite. "Where are you hiding, sweetheart?" Kieran called out, his voice dripping with arrogant amusement. I kept my mouth shut, my eyes adjusting to the ambient light spilling in from the hallway. I could see the dark, wet stains splattered across Kieran's tactical vest. He had slaughtered the loyal guards outside the door. "Vaughn is dead, Brighty," Kieran lied, taking a slow step into the room. Rocco's men ambushed him at the warehouse. He was ripped to pieces. A sharp spike of terror pierced my chest, but I forced it down. I knew Vaughn. He was a monster carved from ice. He would not die that easily. Kieran swept the flashlight across the velvet armchairs, moving closer to the fireplace. "It is just you and me now," Kieran continued, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "And unfortunately for you, Rocco made me a very generous offer. He wants the port logistics, and he wants Vaughn's pregnant whore as a trophy. I hand you over, and I take control of the Vanguard Syndicate." He took another step, the beam of light catching the edge of my emerald silk gown. He stopped, turning the flashlight directly onto my face. I squeezed my eyes shut against the blinding glare. "There you are," he mocked, lowering the light slightly so he could see my face. "Look at you, shaking in the dark. You really thought you belonged here, did you not? You thought a fat, slow maid from the slums could be a queen." He raised the silenced pistol, pointing it directly at my chest. "Walk toward the door, Brighty. Do not make me shoot you in the kneecaps and drag you out by your hair." I opened my eyes, staring into the cold, dead eyes of the traitor. He saw exactly what he wanted to see. He saw a terrified, clumsy, plus-size woman who was entirely out of her depth. He saw a liability. He did not realize that my invisibility was my greatest weapon. He did not realize that while he was busy planning his grand betrayal, I had spent months cleaning this house. I had dusted every baseboard. I had polished every hidden seam of the mahogany panels. I knew the architectural blind spots of this fortress better than the men who built it. I let out a pathetic, trembling sob, playing the part he expected. "Please, Kieran," I begged, my voice cracking perfectly. "Please do not hurt the baby. I will do whatever you want." I took a slow, trembling step forward, moving away from the wall. As I moved, I let my heavy body sway, faking a catastrophic loss of balance. I cried out, my knees buckling beneath me. I collapsed heavily onto the Persian rug, right beside the massive stone hearth of the fireplace. I curled into a ball, wrapping my arms around my stomach, sobbing hysterically. Kieran let out a loud, barking laugh of pure disgust. "Pathetic," he spat, lowering the pistol slightly as he walked toward me. "Get up on your feet, you stupid cow." He stepped onto the edge of the rug, standing right over me. That was his fatal mistake. My right hand shot out, my fingers wrapping around the cold, heavy handle of the solid brass fireplace poker resting on the hearth. The maternal fury that exploded in my chest was not human. It was a dark, primal violence that burned hotter than 1,000 suns. I did not hesitate. I swung the heavy brass poker with every ounce of strength in my broad shoulders. The solid metal connected with the side of Kieran's left knee with a sickening, acoustic crunch. The bone shattered instantly. Kieran let out a high-pitched scream of absolute agony, his leg collapsing beneath him. The flashlight flew from his hand, rolling across the floor and casting wild, spinning shadows on the walls. Before he could even process the pain, I weaponized my size. I launched my heavy frame upward, driving my shoulder directly into his chest. The impact lifted him off his feet. We crashed backward, Kieran's spine slamming violently into the edge of the low marble coffee table. The breath exploded from his lungs in a wet gasp. The silenced pistol clattered out of his grip, sliding across the polished hardwood. I did not stop moving. I scrambled over his thrashing body, my knee pinning his uninjured leg to the floor. I lunged for the pistol, my fingers closing around the warm metal grip. I spun around, dropping to one knee, and aimed the weapon directly at his face. "Do not move a single muscle," I roared, my voice echoing off the high ceilings with a gritty, terrifying authority. Kieran froze, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes wide with shock. He stared at the barrel of his own gun, unable to comprehend how the slow, fat maid had just dismantled him in under 10 seconds. Suddenly, the sound of heavy boots pounding against the hardwood echoed from the hallway. Kieran's men were coming up the stairs. They had heard his scream. "Bridie, you are dead," Kieran hissed through his teeth, clutching his shattered knee. "My men are going to tear you apart." I did not panic. I kept the gun leveled at his chest and slowly backed away, moving toward the far wall of the suite. I reached the massive mahogany bookshelf that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. I knew exactly what was hidden behind the third panel on the left. I had found it 3 months ago while dusting the intricate wood carvings. It was a manual override panel for the third-floor security grid, designed for catastrophic power failures. I reached behind the heavy leather-bound books and found the hidden latch. I pulled it hard. The wooden panel popped open, revealing a red, heavy-duty lever encased in glass. I smashed the glass with the butt of the pistol. I grabbed the red lever and pulled it down with all my weight. A deafening, mechanical siren began to wail through the silent house. The walls of the master suite literally shook as the emergency lockdown protocols engaged. Solid sheets of titanium dropped from the ceilings, slamming into the floor with a force that rattled my teeth. They sealed the windows, they sealed the air vents, and they slammed down over the main entrance to the suite, cutting off the hallway completely. I heard the muffled shouts of Kieran's men on the other side of the blast doors, followed by the useless, frantic thud of bullets hitting the titanium. We were sealed inside the vault. Nothing was getting in, and nothing was getting out. I walked back over to Kieran, my bare feet stepping over the shattered glass. I grabbed him by the collar of his tactical vest and dragged his heavy, bleeding body across the floor. He groaned in agony, leaving a thick smear of blood on the Persian rug. I dragged him to the heavy velvet armchair in the center of the room. I pulled the thick, braided silk cords from the window curtains and tied his wrists tightly to the arms of the chair. I tied his uninjured leg to the heavy wooden base. When I was finished, I stepped back, breathing heavily, the emerald silk of my gown stained with his blood and the soot from the fireplace. I walked over to the matching velvet chair opposite him and sat down. I rested the heavy silenced pistol on the curve of my pregnant belly, keeping the barrel pointed directly at his chest. And then, we waited. The hours bled away in the dark, silent vault. Kieran drifted in and out of consciousness, his head lolling against his chest, his breathing shallow and wet. I did not sleep. I did not blink. I sat in the dark, feeling the strong, steady kicks of my unborn child against my ribs. I was no longer the frightened girl from South Boston. The fire had burned away the weakness, leaving only cold, hardened steel. Just before dawn, the mechanical siren chirped twice. The heavy titanium blast doors covering the main entrance began to rise, the hydraulic gears grinding loudly. The harsh emergency lights from the hallway flooded into the room. I tightened my grip on the pistol, my finger resting lightly on the trigger. Vaughn stepped through the doorway. He looked like a nightmare pulled straight from hell. His custom suit was shredded, soaked in dark, drying blood. He had a deep, jagged cut across his forehead, the blood tracking down the side of his aristocratic face. He held a heavy assault rifle in his hands, his eyes wild and frantic. He had fought his way through the ambush at the warehouse, and he had fought his way through Kieran's men in the lower levels of the house. He came into the room expecting a massacre. He expected to find my broken body on the floor. Instead, he stopped dead in his tracks. The assault rifle slowly lowered to his side. He stared at the scene in front of him, his chest heaving. Kieran was tied to the chair, broken, bleeding, and whimpering in pain. And I was sitting across from him, bathed in the harsh light, covered in soot and blood. The heavy emerald silk draped over my swollen belly like royal armor. The silenced pistol was held perfectly steady in my hands, Vaughn dropped the rifle. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. He walked slowly toward me, his eyes wide with absolute, religious awe. He fell to his knees right in front of my chair, ignoring the blood on the rug. He reached out with trembling hands, gently taking the pistol from my grip and tossing it aside. He buried his face in the heavy silk covering my lap, his broad shoulders shaking with the force of his relief. "You are alive," he choked out, his voice breaking completely. "My beautiful, terrifying queen, you are alive." I looked down at the monster who had bought my life, who had trapped me in this gilded cage, who had swapped my pills to bind me to him forever. I reached out, my fingers tangling in his dark, blood-matted hair. I looked at the broken traitor bleeding out on the floor. I looked at the titanium walls of the empire I had just saved. I realized, with a dark, chilling clarity, that I no longer wanted to escape. I did not want to be invisible anymore. I wanted the power. I wanted the control. I tilted Vaughn's head back, forcing him to look up at me. His dark eyes were filled with absolute devotion. He finally understood that I was not just his captive. I was his equal. "Clean up the mess in our house, Vaughn," I commanded, my voice cold, steady, and echoing with the absolute authority of the matriarch. "And then, you are going to tell me exactly how we are going to destroy Rocco." Vaughn smiled, a dark, lethal grin that promised the world would burn at my command. "Yes, my matriarch," he whispered. "Whatever you desire,